Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Geopolitical Futures podcast. I'm Cole. Joining me today is Jacob.
I'm so enjoying my family vacation right now that I needed to get away from my family vacation, which is not to say I don't love my family, but say that I just really miss you.
Well, that's what vacations are all about, right? Scheduling business podcasts with people you work with. How do you feel about that, Xander? Joining us is Xander too. How's it going over there?
It's going great. I'm coming at you live from a hotel room in Las Vegas, but not the fun part because I also have family here.
There are people from Las Vegas.
It's
Cool.
Hard to believe. I know, right?
I did not know that. That's fascinating. But this is what the holidays are all about. If I sound a little stuffy, it's because I've been spending time with my family too. Not stuffy, stuffed up. I've had like nieces and nephews like crawling all over me and like throwing things at me and getting their germy little hands on me. So I'm probably going to be deathly ill for the next week or two. But again, this is what the holidays are about: getting ill, scheduling podcasts. We are actually gathered here today to talk a little bit about geopolitics. This is a Geopolitical Futures podcast after all. So despite the government shutdown, what's really getting a lot of media play right now, of course, is the situation in northeastern Syria, after Trump announced that he would withdraw all troops. And so we've been kind of going back and forth on this. Now we've already published a piece. Xander actually wrote a really good piece at the end of last week, kind of laying out some of the implications from some different perspectives. But what we didn't touch on in that piece is sort of the way some of this is going to play out. And I don't want to give too much away right now. I want to leave it for the conversation. But what I want to do first, before we get into this, is sort of lay out what exactly we know, right? So we know Trump announced a withdrawal. We know Mattis resigned. And we do know that Turkey, to whatever degree, is going to see this as a green light to kind of do what it wants to do. It's basically left to its own devices now. After that, it starts to get a little muddled. I mean, you've seen there was a really funny and explosive AP report last week. We can get into that in a second. There are reports that the Kurds are going to just release Islamic State fighters. They're like, oh, do you think the Islamic State fight's over? What if we just released all of our prisoners? It's not over then, right? They're talking about how they may actually align with Syria in a fight against Turkey instead of Islamic State. We don't really know. So there's a lot of noise out there. So I want y'all to kind of hash it out and say what's noise and what's not noise. Does that kind of make sense?
Sure,
Let's do it.
So what's going on? Who wants to start?
Well, there's a couple of other updates worth mentioning. At the end of last week, we had heard the announcement about the withdrawal of troops. We had heard the announcement about the cessation of airstrikes by the U.S. against ISIS fighters in conjunction with the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, which is comprised primarily by, but not entirely by, Kurdish fighters. So far, that hasn't happened. The airstrikes are still going on for what we know. We know that over the weekend, the executive order was signed to approve withdrawal of forces from Syria. So we know that's happening. We also know that President Trump and President Erdogan of Turkey had a conversation that both seemed to walk away fairly positively with all the tensions that have been going on between Turkey and the U.S. Turkey complaining about the U.S. not doing enough. Erdogan walked away and said something along the lines of, it was a positive call. And Trump kind of changed his rhetoric a little bit. And I know we don't want to focus too much on rhetoric, but we are kind of laying out what we know right now. And while initially the timeline for withdrawal of forces was 60 to 100 days, after this conversation, Trump said that it would be a slow withdrawal, highly coordinated with Turkey. So in other words, there's clearly some sort of agreement that's either been hashed out or is in the process of being hashed out between the U.S. and Turkey. We know that the representatives from the SDF have gone to Moscow, and there's an anonymous report, so we don't really know who said it, that Russia offered to send Syrian army border patrols to areas east of the Euphrates, which is presumably where Turkey would launch its offensive, basically in order to protect the Kurds now that the U.S. won't be there. So there's kind of this balance going on right now between Turkey invading northern Syria and Assad, and potentially Russia encouraging him, having this last opportunity to get a bunch of Syrian army forces into northern Syria without a fight in order to preempt Turkey. But of course, then that places Russia to a degree, and Syria in potentially the way of a Turkish offensive, which is something that Russia also wants to avoid. So I think that's current as of this morning.
Yeah, you always knew Russia was gonna jump in just immediately because Russia has always been kind of opportunistic like that. I do want to talk about that. Let's put a pin in Russia though. Um, Jacob, you had some interesting thoughts about this quote unquote Turkish invasion into Syria. Do you want to kind of share that with our listeners?
Sure, well, but first I want to respond to what Xander said and a little bit to what you said, which is to say that almost none of the things that you just talked about were new. It's not new that the Russians and the Kurds talk sometimes. It's not new that the Syrian Kurds have been negotiating with the Syrian government and trying to trade some sort of de facto recognition of autonomy for their allegiance to the Syrian government led by Assad. I think the really novel thing here, and it's become clear after this weekend, is that the United States and Turkey are moving closer together. And it's not really clear whether that was a plan or whether Turkey was expecting that or whether Turkey is getting sucked in by forces that it can't control. And I think the thing that Xander and I might talk about here a little bit is I don't think that Turkey particularly wanted to do this. I think Turkey is stuck and has to now assert itself greater in Syria. And I think that was part of the design for the strategic decision makers in the United States who made this decision that the United States had done enough. It was time to let Turkey come in and do some of the dirty work.
Do you how eager do you think Turkey is to do that? Right. So you're kind of alluding to that AP report I was talking about earlier, where it was the announcement. And Erdogan was like, "Whoa, hold on a second. Like maybe we're not quite ready for that." So I think there probably is some validity to that. But what exactly does Turkey want then?
I don't think anybody wants to be in Syria. It's like a hot potato. Nobody wants to be caught controlling it. It's nice if you can move it in the direction that you want to move it, but there's no way that, in my opinion, that Turkey wants to be on the ground enforcing the rule of law in northern Syria any more than any of these countries want to be the ones responsible for the rule of law in Syria. That's why Russia wants a constitutional committee. That's why Iran wants Assad to take over everything as soon as possible. Why Turkey has been trying to work with its proxies. That's why the United States has proxies. This is literally a really unstrategic piece of land for most of these countries in the middle of the desert that's going to be ungovernable, and mostly it's populated by disillusioned young Sunni Arabs who have no prospect of getting jobs, especially after their country and their education system and infrastructure has been destroyed over the past almost decade now.
Xander, I'd like you to jump in and respond to that because you actually had a different idea of some, I guess, what you might call some ancillary reasons why Turkey, I don't want to say eager for a military operation, but it has some other reasons why it might want to do that. Do you want to explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm not sure if what it necessarily means when we say Turkey, quote unquote, wants something. I think at this point it is in Turkey's interest to move further into Syria after having already done it. And whether or not Turkey, again, wants to establish these governing institutions or not, it's already doing it. They're already there in Afrin. They've already been issuing things like passports and setting up semi-permanent governing structures in these areas that are, if not directly overseen by Turkey, then indirectly overseen by Turkey. They are using proxy forces, yes, but they also have a sizable Turkish armed forces deployment in Ifrin and a smaller one in Idlib. The point is, Turkey's there directly in addition to proxies. And at this point, it wants to eliminate what it considers to be the threat from the PKK, which is the Kurdistan's Workers' Party, which is the terrorist group in Turkey, and it considers the Syrian Kurds to basically be an affiliate of that. And that has been sort of the driving motivation for Turkey becoming more involved in Syria from its initial invasion in October 2016 with Operations Euphrates Shield, as well as the one from earlier this year in Afrin. That's what is driving Turkey's intervention. Now, I saw it was an interesting tweet from someone at the Institute for the Study of War the other day, which I think is a great organization, by the way. But they said, it's just not reliable for America to expect its allies to take a greater role in these areas. Look at what happened in 2014. Turkey was actually aiding and abetting ISIS to a degree. And I think what that misses is in 2014, ISIS was actively working against Assad, which is one of Turkey's adversaries. And now Turkey has an opportunity to move into northern Syria to eliminate a Kurdish threat And that will bring it into confrontation with ISIS, which is what America has wanted all along, a semi-permanent, more professional military force in that area to control ISIS that it doesn't need to support. And it needed to support the SDF. The SDF couldn't have done all that fighting without U.S. support, but Turkey can do it to a greater extent without the U.S. So does Turkey want to be in northern Syria? Jacob, I don't actually know that, but I think at this point it is in Turkey's interest to move in, take that territory while the opportunity is still there. And in the long run, we expect Turkey to be a more powerful more powerful country in the Middle East and to play a larger role. And part of that does involve getting sucked in by the chaos to its east. And this is just one example of it.
Yeah, I hear you. I want to say two very brief things, and then tackle this from a geographic perspective. First of all, the Institute for the Study of War is a good publication, I would say, and has some good information, but I find them to be generally warmongering, and they generally try and talk things up. They put a report out just the other day about Russian forces in Ukraine and said, you don't have to think at all about Russian intentions, just look at what's on the ground, which to me was like a mind-bogglingly simple and actually dangerous way of trying to think about something. Like, literally the job of analysis is to figure out intentions, and ignoring intentions is silly. The second thing is just that I think we have to be a little careful when we talk about the rise of ISIS, because what do we mean when we say Turkey aided and abetted, I think was the language that you used.
I didn't use that language. They did. I just want to clarify. They were talking about the border issue, but I didn't use that language. I was quoting them.
Oh, okay. So you were talking about them. I think that a lot of people on a lot of different sides of this argument want to use who sponsored ISIS for political purposes here and there. And it's true that Turkey, I think, thought they could manipulate ISIS and didn't close off their borders to some of the, weapons flows or trade flows that helped ISIS emerge in the first place. But, I wouldn't say that, I'm not sure that you could say that any one country bears responsibility. Like the United States bears responsibility for invading Iraq and then leaving suddenly as much as Turkey does, for its borders being opened as much as Saudi Arabia does, for funding a lot of these groups over periods of decades. The Islamic State rose out of a constellation of different circumstances. But the thing I wanted to hit on is the geography of northern Syria that you kind of alluded to. And the area that the bulk of the Kurdish population is it's in this geographic area been called the Jazeera. And it's this flat plateau, and it's almost completely indefensible. And one of the issues here that I think we forget about with all the politics is, look, the borders as we know them today, as the borders that when you look at a map, Syria, Turkey, Iraq, these are all fake borders that were drawn by colonial powers, and they're unraveling to an extent. So I think you're right to say that Turkey has an interest in neutralizing some threats from this particular plateau, and they can on this particular plateau. This part of northern Syria also happens to be a breadbasket, also happens to have a lot of oil resources, kind of makes sense. It's quite another thing to go, actually take out the major population centers in Syria, the places where the economy is located, places like Aleppo, Damascus, these other things. I think you're right to say that Turkey has identified a threat in Syrian Kurdish autonomy in some of these regions. It's a threat that can be fairly easily dealt with. That the more Turkey gets drawn in, the more it has to make these other decisions. And I go back to what I said. I don't think Turkey wants any part of this. I don't think Turkey is trying to create a neo-colonialist 21st century Ottoman Empire where it's colonizing different states. I think it wants to co-opt these regimes. It wants to have Sunni Muslims in charge of Sunni Muslims who they can actually talk to and work with, because that's going to be the basis on which they can best connect.
Yeah, but I'll ask you this. I mean, that's how much of the Ottoman Empire was run, right? All of their European provinces were run by boyars and local nobles that, so long as they paid taxes, is not, the Turkish military might have had some border deployments and fortresses, but it was all run and governed and administered by locals. So I don't understand how that's substantially different from Turkey asserting greater control to its east with minimal direct deployment.
Well, because they conquered those things, and the system of government that arose after it came after they had conquered it. I don't see a situation here where Turkey wants to go into the Middle East or has an imperative to conquer Syria. Now, I think what it does, and I think you've pointed out correctly, there are some threats here with the Kurds, and it does not want the Kurds to congeal into any kind of singular nation state. And this is the flip side of what you said. The United States and its relationships in the Middle East, I think, everybody should forget about relationships being in the Middle East being anything but pragmatic and completely transient. But for the Kurds, and a lot of people feel bad for the Kurds, and I understand why they feel bad for the Kurds. But look, the Kurds are a group potentially of tens of millions of people spanning across at least 4 different countries. And if the Kurds are going to have a nation state, the Kurds are going to have to band together and put aside some of their internal differences, of which there are many. You cannot expect Russia or the United States or any one country to come in and gift a nation state on a completely indefensible plateau to a small group of Syrian Kurds. And again, I just want to be really clear. I'm not talking about that from any kind of moral perspective. I'm just saying when you look at what it would take on the ground for any of these countries, not just the United States, but for any of these countries to do that, and the resources that would be necessary for that, I'm not sure any of them have. The United States couldn't even pacify Iraq.
So I guess the only response I have to that, and I think ultimately, Jacob, you and I are agreeing on most parts here, but when you say that these places would need to be conquered first, if it were to have more of a direct parallel with history, I look at Afrin and I look at the area, sort of that triangular area that was carved out just to the east of Afrin in northern Syria during Operations Euphrates Shield as direct conquests by Turkey with the support of local proxies. I mean, the majority of the fighting was done with proxies, but Turkey sent tanks, Turkey sent armored vehicles, Turkey sent ground forces, and this is very similar to how the Ottomans conducted a lot of their warfare too. They would send some janissaries, which are the core of the they weren't a conscript army, but they were the most loyal forces to the Sultan. And then a lot of the fighting would be done by local forces, by the Timurid cavalry, by whatever local lords were called upon to bring forces to do their service. It was conquered, and then those troops would be either stationed partially there as a border force or withdrawn and sent to other theaters, and then it'd be administered locally. And that's what I see happening in northern Syria. And again, over the weekend, we have seen the deployment of, there's a convoy of like 100 vehicles is what the report says. Maybe 35 of those were tanks. And to your point about the Jazeera being this big open flat plateau, this is not hard land to conquer if you have, armored forces to surround these towns with. You don't need to go in and engage in close quarters urban fighting in order to lay siege to these towns and starve them out and bring them under subjugation and then establish some sort of local force. So this does seem to me like Turkey expanding more aggressively. Again, whether it wants to or not, it is in its interest to do this right now. And I see close parallels with Ottoman expansion.
Yeah, but again, like if you're moving, like everybody in the media is saying, they're moving east of the Euphrates. Turkey is moving east of the Euphrates. The only thing that's east of the Euphrates is desert. There's nothing out there. Once you've taken some of these areas on the border, or you can hew very, very closely to where the river runs through the desert, the rest of what you're talking about here is desert. This is about Turkey neutralizing a threat on the border from some Syrian Kurdish groups. The map is deceiving because you can have all of technically eastern Syria on a map, and basically all you have is a handful of towns and a bunch of desert. That's what the Islamic State had. Syria itself, the sort of Ottoman province that contains Syria and Palestine and Lebanon and other areas, we're talking about places like Aleppo and Damascus and all these ports on the Mediterranean. And I think Turkey would like a pliable regime in Damascus. They would certainly like to, over time, weaken Assad to the point where a Sunni Arab regime that is more friendly to Turkey can come into power there. I think that's the long play for them. But they're not going to march Turkish soldiers and roll Turkish tanks into Damascus. The most they're going to be willing to do here is, okay, they'll take some border towns, they'll go a little bit into the desert where the highways can allow them to do that. But even that, I mean, they're being forced to do that. In a perfect world, Assad would have been overthrown and they would have as productive a relationship with whoever replaced them as the Iranians currently have with Assad today.
Xander, you brought up an interesting point. We talk about historical parallels to the Ottoman Empire. I mean, in the Janissaries and what have you. Gone are the days where Ottoman officials would abscond with people's children and acculturate them to the standing military and raise them in the palace to just be like insanely loyal, like King's Guard, basically. But at the same time, Turkey is doing some sort of interesting things with its own military right now. They've prioritized sort of their own, indigenous capabilities so that they're not just U.S. buyers like Saudi Arabia. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and whether or not that actually plays into some of their operations in northern Syria?
It's a good question. I mean, the point you make is good. Whenever you draw historical parallels, you need to be really careful because you can only certain things repeat themselves in history, but there were no tanks in the 17th century, right? So right off the bat, there are differences. Turkey's big push for having a larger domestic military industry is not new. It really came into play sort of in the 70s after its invasion of Cyprus and establishing the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, and it faced I forget it was sanctions or arms embargo from the U.S. But basically, the U.S. made it harder for Turkey to acquire the foreign military arms that it depended on at the time. And really, ever since that time, especially beginning in the early 80s, it began more aggressively investing in its own domestic military capabilities, just meaning that they didn't need to go abroad to buy the things that they felt their army needed. So we are seeing some of that in action. We are seeing Turkey using some of its own native arms systems in Syria, some of the tanks, some of the armored vehicles. And I think it's certainly Turkey's first major test with its native arms systems, certainly because it hasn't been in any sort of major war. Well, like aside from the suppressing the PKK in the 80s and 90s, it hasn't been in any sort of foreign war where it's deployed these sorts of systems since the 70s. What role that's having in Syria, honestly, I don't know. I couldn't tell you. It seemed like they learned lessons between their initial invasion in 2016 and the second one in Afrin. They increased the tempo of their airstrikes. They were able to move more quickly and take more territory at a faster rate. So, but those could also just be lessons learned from conducting war, or could have been being in a somewhat more secure domestic situation because the 2016 invasion occurred right after the failed coup. So maybe Erdogan had consolidated more power by then. I don't know. I guess I don't have a great answer for you there.
Well, and I don't want to oversimplify either. I mean, it's not like Turkey has stopped trying to buy weapons from other providers. I mean, there was a pretty big dust up about, S-400s earlier this year. That's a whole can of worms we don't necessarily need to get into. Jacob, I wanted to ask you something too. I mean, to your point, it's well taken. Talk about it a lot, and it's always true that alliances are always temporary in the Middle East. With that in mind, though, I think it's probably fair to say that generally speaking, even if it's in a nebulous way, Turkey kind of stands to benefit from the US leaving. Now, maybe you don't agree, but I think that's sort of like the consensus wisdom right now. So I guess walk us through who else, if anybody else, stands to benefit from this, and who is most directly hurt by this, other than obviously the Kurds.
Yeah, I mean, benefit is a strange word, and you might be right that in the long term, this might favor Turkey or some other country, but I really do think that if you're looking at the board right now, I'm not sure that Turkey was expecting this or that this is particularly good for Turkey at this particular moment in time. And I'm not sure it actually benefits anyone in particular so much as it just completely changes the calculations that everybody has to make, because the United States, what it was really doing there, besides providing some support to Syrian Kurds, was the United States was basically blocking different groups from going or pushing too far, right? There was that strange story about the Russian military contractors that got blown up by a U.S. airstrike near the border with Jordan. That also has to do with making sure that Iran stays inside of a certain box and doesn't go in a certain area. Just by virtue of supporting the Syrian Kurds, the United States was basically keeping Turkey in its position. It was also keeping the Assad regime where it goes. By taking the United States out of that equation, you remove one variable and one complicating variable, but then you also basically set up a situation where Russia, Turkey, and Iran all have to figure out how they're going to interact with each other now that this sort of blocking force in between them is gone. And, lurking behind all of this is also the Assad regime and disillusioned Sunnis and the remnants of the Islamic State. Hezbollah is on the ground there too. The Israelis are even looking around too. So I look at the situation and I don't see that anybody particularly benefits just by virtue of the U.S. withdrawing. I think it creates a lot of opportunities. It creates a lot of uncertainty. It creates a lot of challenges for the powers that are there, and that all depends on how those different powers are going to move and negotiate. I think Turkey is probably best suited to realize some of its goals, and I think that Russia, if it can get some kind of deal to stabilize the Assad regime, it can also achieve its goal of having gone in and saved Assad and leaving. But I mean, this is all very fluid. I think one of the reasons that the establishment has pushed back against President Donald Trump is because the way that Trump did this, it was fairly sudden, and it doesn't allow for that kind of preparation in advance of something like this happening. But that's been true of Trump since the very beginning.
Yes, and if you believe sort of the media narrative that has developed around this, in terms of U.S. credibility, we're hearing a lot about U.S. credibility again. Can the U.S. be trusted? Will its allies feel like they have somebody that they can rely on? And when the U.S. says it's going to do something, and all that whole narrative, I think it's a bit overplayed myself. I have an idea of what you guys are going to say, but I do want you to sort of explore that a little bit. So Jacob, when you say Russia, Iran, Turkey, all these other countries, friend or foe, whatever, of the United States, this is going to change their calculation. To what extent is U.S. credibility or U.S. reliability going to be a factor in those calculations?
Let me just jump in and say very briefly, to the extent that credibility exists at all, let's just look at what the United States has done in the Middle East, just in this section of the Middle East. It sponsored a coup against a democratically elected government in Iran. It overthrew Saddam Hussein in Iraq without a very good plan for what was going to come afterwards. And also, in the early 90s, didn't do much for its Iraqi Kurdish partners on the ground after the first Gulf War. It said that it was in favor of taking down the Assad regime, but then did nothing to take down the Assad regime, even after it went across President Obama's red line. The United States has a relationship with Saudi Arabia, even though Saudi Arabia is one of the biggest proponents of and spreaders of jihadist Islamist ideology in the world, pre 9/11 and even post 9/11. So I don't know what credibility there was for the United States there in the first place, beyond to say that credibility is just a word that people use to try and understand a country's actions. And I think that in the Middle East, the United States has actually been pretty naked about what it does, that it pursues things just for interest. I think the deeper issue with the United States is that what the United States does in the Middle East is usually reactive. It is not long-term. It never thinks long-term. It puts out one fire and then it moves to the next fire. And if I could say that the thing that I think is most damaging for the United States is that any power in the Middle East knows that eventually the United States will get tired and leave. So it's about biding your time until the United States has exhausted itself, and then you try and make some realities on the ground. I think the interesting thing about Syria is that the United States surprised almost everyone on the ground by pulling out a little earlier than everybody thought they were going to, but this is what the United States does. So if credibility means predictability in how the United States behaves, the United States is behaving exactly as it always behaves. If credibility refers to some kind of ethereal level of trust between nations, I think that does exist in the world between certain nations, but I don't think that has existed between the United States and just about any Middle Eastern country, Israel being the one exception. And even there, I think that's a much more complicated discussion than most people treat it.
I would also throw in the Iran-Iraq war, just as which kind of gets overlooked, I think, when we talk about U.S. duplicity in the region over the years. But that's just a soapbox. Xander, jump in here. Do you agree? Do you disagree?
I agree. I've been getting a lot of emails from readers actually in response to the piece that I wrote on Thursday about the withdrawal, saying, what you've completely omitted in a geopolitical analysis of the impact on U.S. credibility on this action. What does it mean? Are people going to ever be able to trust the U.S. if we just throw our allies into the bus? And Jacob gave a lot of really good recent examples of the U.S. doing that and people still coming to the U.S. when necessary. But I actually ended up using older historical examples. And I think the reason that at GPF we focus so often on the notion of interests is because when a state can benefit from working with another state, it will do that. It will do that until it can no longer benefit. And that just tends to be how states work in the international system. My friend gave me a great line, or he told me this line several months ago. He said, loyalty is born from necessity and not gratitude. And I think that says more about the international system than he even intended in the moment, but it's true. So if you look at the 19th century, the examples that come to my mind are Great Britain's strategy with the continent. So when Great Britain was fighting against Napoleon, it was Great Britain and Prussia and Russia, right? And then you have a couple decades of peace, and then all of a sudden Great Britain is allying with France against Russia, fighting in support of the Ottoman Empire. And then a couple decades later, it is Great Britain not caring about Russia threatening the Ottoman Empire until the Ottomans look like they're about to collapse, and Russia's going to threaten India, and then Great Britain sides with the Ottomans again. And then in World War One, it is Great Britain siding with France again, its historical enemy, against Germany and the Ottomans. And it's just like, if you look at each of these examples at the moment that it was happening, and you had, I don't know what the British public was saying at the time, but, oh, look, our country is abandoning our allies. And it's like, well, still, you had states making decisions at the time that benefited them based on what their interests were at the time. And I don't think it is a surprise that the U.S. abandoned the Kurds. I mean, we were writing about this 2 years ago, saying the U.S. will support the Kurds so long as they continue to fight against ISIS, which was what the U.S. interests in Syria really were. And as soon as their motivations move beyond that and any sort of inkling of some sort of independent Kurdistan becomes a primary motivation, the U.S. isn't going to support that, because ultimately the U.S. interests are allied more with Turkey in having an ally to either contain or work against Russia. So credibility, I think, does exist. As Jacob mentioned, this ethereal sense of trust, maybe in the short term and maybe against countries whose interests align. But ultimately, states will do things that benefit them. And no matter what the U.S. has done to throw its allies under the bus in the past, in the future, if it benefits a state or a non-state actor to receive aid from the U.S. in order to benefit whatever their cause is, they're going to do it, regardless of what happened with the Kurds in 2018.
Yeah, and I also just want to say, and I think we have to be also, especially because we are Americans, at least three of us on this call, not all of us at GPF are, but the three of us are. But there is also an anti-American narrative where America is the most exceptional, the beacon of light for the world, and that yet when things go wrong, you have to blame everything on the United States. We talk a lot about, the United States being quote unquote duplicitous, the United States quote unquote throwing its allies under the bus. We talk much less about the U.S.'s supposed allies throwing it under the bus. We talk a lot less about just how transactional all of these relationships have been in history. So I think that too much focus gets put, and I mean, I shouldn't say too much, a lot of focus gets put on the United States because the United States is the most powerful country. But I think that breeds a narrative that is difficult. The other thing I just want to say, and I think this is particularly difficult for Americans, and the American media is a lot of what is defining some of these tropes right now when it comes to the Middle East. But if you look at the United States involvement in Afghanistan, when you look at the United States involvement in Iraq going back to the second Bush administration, I would say very clearly that the United States lost its war in Afghanistan and it lost the war in Iraq, which is to say it did not achieve its objective. The United States has a tough time admitting that it's lost wars. I think a lot of what you're seeing right now is an unwillingness to sort of recognize, okay, the objectives that the United States is going to pursue were not achieved. And instead of regrouping, admitting defeat, admitting a mistake, there is this need for the United States to always be right and always know what it's doing next and always be the most powerful. And I think that complicates the way that people think about U.S. strategy in the Middle East.
Peace with honor, right?
Well, yeah, that was what Nixon had to generate before the United States could get out of Vietnam. But that's another one. If you say to some Vietnam War veterans that the United States lost the war in Vietnam, some of them will sadly nod their heads at you. Some of them will appreciate your candor, and some of them will think that you're a traitor, you're guilty of treason because they were there and the United States won all the battles. But again, I sort of look at war as you have certain objectives that you want to pursue. And in terms of the United States objectives in Vietnam, in Iraq, and Afghanistan, the United States was not able to achieve them. And the problem with the United States is that, A, it's not really willing to say that and make a different move. And then B, because of democracy, the United States has different administrations that come to power with different views. And that can change the application of policy. And that also means that countries in the world have to deal with a new set of decision makers usually every 4 years. The Syrian Kurds or the Assad regime or all these others, they've been dealing with the same Russian president and the same apparatus in Russia for what, decades now. Same is true of the regime in Iran. I mean, Rouhani is not his first rodeo, and he's been a part of the establishment for a long time. The establishment there has been rooted there for a long time. It's not true of the United States. It's one minute you have Obama, the next minute you have Trump, and while I think a lot of the changes are superficial, for if you're a foreign country and you're trying to interact with the United States, you spend 8 years developing some kind of basis for a relationship with the Obama administration, and the Trump administration comes in, and you have to figure out what the heck you're going to do. I think that also has an effect on how people view the United States. One of the byproducts of having a democracy where policy actually can change if you vote new people into power.
I think a good contemporary example of this too is on the Korean Peninsula, right? South Korea and the United States have been allies for a really long time, even pretty good allies, I think you could say. But I don't think it's necessarily seen as a betrayal or a duplicitous action that the United States is starting to scratch its head and say, like, I'm not totally comfortable with ICBMs that can actually reach our mainland. Maybe we should do something about this. I don't know. And it's not a betrayal or duplicity for South Korea to be like, yeah, you're our allies, but we're the ones who are going to get, the most beat up in any sort of, military conflict here. So that's kind of why you see, South Korea charting its own course in the North Korea talks and taking very, 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 very early small steps toward unification against U.S. wishes. But I don't think the U.S. is really going to care one way or another if it gets what it wants from North Korea and if South Korea kind of gets what it wants. So yeah, this isn't the Cold War anymore. It's not just betrayals and it's not just dichotomies. It's just, countries are in hard situations and they're trying to like do right by themselves.
Well, it's why I don't like that language. Like, I don't like the language of duplicity or of throwing allies under the bus or things like that. If you want an example of duplicity, how about the Soviet-Nazi non-aggression pact, where Hitler was absolutely planning to invade the Soviet Union at some point and breaks the non-aggression pact by the Nazi armies rolling into the Soviet Union. That's duplicity. That's betrayal. Different countries moving around and pursuing different interests in the moment when they haven't even signed any kind of treaty or established that they're going to be pursuing, interests on paper or by any kind of whether democratic or executive decision-making process. I mean, it's easy. It's very easy to say, well, there was this, and then there was duplicity, and then there was a conspiracy. And honestly, a lot of the times it doesn't work that way. The number of times you can actually see a major act of betrayal between two countries, there are not that many when you start actually trying to count them.
I agree. I would, I don't want to litigate the word duplicitous like all that much necessarily. Whatever word you want to use, like Soviet behavior and U.S. behavior during that conflict was, I don't know how we want to say it, ruthlessly Machiavellian, right? We were staunch allies of.
It was opportunistic, just people pursuing their interests. I'm not saying that there isn't a moral level to this.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. Well, and arming one side like a little bit more to varying degrees so that no one could really win. They would just like bloody the hell out of each other, so that nobody could actually come up on top. And then the tacit agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union to enable that to happen, and the tanker wars, like that's, again, I don't want to get overly moralistic, right? But at the same time, it's like you couldn't call that like strictly moral behavior. But again, I don't want to get too semantic here. It's just this is why I bring it up.
I don't know why we're talking about strictly moral behavior. Like, we're just talking about how nations behave. And most of the times, the way that nations leaders in these moments make these decisions, it's not some grand plan where somebody has some evil aim that they want to get to. Usually you have decision makers and bureaucrats in a moment just trying to get to the next day, just trying to prevent the next big catastrophe. Like I say, that the moments in time in history where you can identify a long-range thinker who had some big plot to use deceit and arms and all these other things to achieve some kind of ruthless objective. It's actually very rare. If you look at every single step, if you just look at the United States involvement in Syria, at every single step, I'm sure that there was some paper pusher who was like, okay, well, in the moment I can justify this because this will be for the greatest good, both for the United States and for as much as possible as it can be for the region. It's not like the United States went into Iraq, and in 2004, 2005 was plotting that it would also try to bring down the Assad regime and would use the Kurds to wipe up the remnants of, whatever happened after Iraq and then would betray them.
Of course
that's not how it happened. Just a series of decisions that get made over time. And that's why I say I don't think it's just semantic there. I think the moment you start using some of that language, you begin to color your understanding of what's going on.
I think that's really the takeaway from this entire conversation, which is the language that you use to describe world events can influence people's understanding of it, right? And I keep coming back to how we tend to focus on interests and why we do it and why it's a useful way to think about the way that states act. And I think as Americans, all of us on the call, but also just Americans in this country, the way that we've been pulled into foreign wars historically have been with moralistic arguments. And frankly, most of the time, most states use moralistic arguments to encourage their public to go to war. So it is hard to detach from that a narrative that becomes so inborn, so common, so familiar. And yet it is that degree of the detachment that helps you better understand what is driving states to act certain ways. So I do think that that language, like you said, Jacob, tends to color people's sense of what's going on and actually kind of gets in the way of seeing things clearly, regardless of whether things are good or bad.
Okay, I think we've beaten this horse to death.
Beaten the camel to death?
Or the camel, yeah. Do we want to talk about what beating to death means versus horse versus camel? I don't know. It's what are words? I'm just kidding.
What was the name of that philosopher who was obsessed with language and words? I always forget him. The German 20th
all of them?
No, it's just no. There was Wittgenstein.
Oh God, that guy.
Was he the one who said that, like, if you gave like a lion the power of speech, that you still wouldn't be able to understand what he's saying? Was that him?
I've never heard that one from him, but he's the one who says that, like, language is a game that we use to, like, communicate or something.
Yeah, it was something like the broader point was that, like, it's not just words in English or German or whatever, that language is sort of a reflection also of thought process, right? And so if all of a sudden, yeah. So basically, it was like if you told a lion to speak, his nature and his thought process is such that, like, the way he would think of things together, it wouldn't come out. All right, I think that's probably a good place to leave it. We don't want to get too circuitous here, but yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see what happens in northern Syria in the coming days and weeks. I think we'll leave it there. Jacob, thanks a lot for joining us. Xander, thank you for taking the time from, I assume, gambling and drinking and going to the clubs out in Las Vegas right now to talk to your work buddies.
'Tis the season to be merry, or something like that.
Something like that. Yeah, that's a very happy holiday. Yeah, no, this is recording just before Christmas,
and we'll probably publish it tomorrow on Christmas Day, I would guess.
Oh, nice. Well, some poor editor is going to have to do that. Sucks to be him.
Well, yeah, it does. But Merry Christmas from two Jews in coal to all of you and yours.
Oh, thanks. But yeah, happy holidays. We'll see you guys after the break. Remember, you can always check us out at geopoliticalfutures.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can follow us individually on Twitter. We're out there. If you feel so moved this holiday season, buy yourself a present to Geopolitical Futures or someone if they might like it, buy them a subscription. And I guess no more announcements. Oh, we've got the annual forecast coming out in a couple of days. So keep your eyes out for that. And until next time, thank you very much. We'll see you later.